The false family? My mom and I moved around a lot when I was born in upstate New York, lived in Connecticut for a while, then after my parents got divorced, my mother and I moved to San Diego to live with her boyfriend before we eventually moved up to Portland, Oregon, to live with my maternal aunt. When I was 12, we stayed there till I was 18, and aside from one or two cons, there were a lot of pros to growing up in Portland. But when I first moved there, I'd say for the year or so, I hated it, and it was mostly down to one man. A couple of days after we moved, I was riding my bike up and down the street when I saw this kid around my age walking up the street. He had a plastic grocery bag in his hand, and it looked like it was full, but whatever was in it was moving. As I drew level with him, I stopped my bike and asked what he had in the bag. And he smiled, walked up to me, then opened up the bag to show me a bunch of fish that he'd caught that afternoon. I'd always lived in the city, but up in Portland, we were out on the edge of town, where it was a lot greener than the other places I'd lived. I'd never been around much fishing or hunting, so I thought it was wild that this kid was just walking up the street with a bag of fish that he had just pulled out of a pond. But to him, it was like the most normal thing in the world. And what blew my mind even more is when I asked what he was going to do with them, and he replied, probably eat them. I thought he was the single coolest kid I'd ever met in my life, and it turned out that he lived down the street. So I asked if he'd teach me how to fish. He said sure, then a few days later, we were on our way down to the old fishing hole that he used to frequent. Brett, my new buddy, used to make his fishing rods out of nothing but sticks along with whatever hooks and lines he could steal from his dad. I thought it was the most badass thing ever. A kid of 14 years old catching his own fish with homemade rods. And from then on, I was obsessed. That whole summer, Brett and I would go fishing just about any chance we got, and we'd take any fish that we caught home to his mom, who would just fry them up and then serve them up with some hush puppies and slaw. We had some great times at that old fishing hole. But after a while, Brett said that he'd found an even better place to fish. It was a longer walk than our first fishing spot, but Brett said that it was a much larger pond, which meant much larger fish. So off we went one Friday afternoon to check it out for the first time. Brett was right about it being a much better pond. The only problem was, we didn't know that we were intruding on anyone's spot. People can get real grouchy if you're too close to their preferred fishing spot, and downright angry if you try and supplant them altogether. So, we were actually aware that someone might come along and take issue with us being there, and then, lo and behold, it took just hours before someone did. We were sitting on the edge of the pond when we suddenly heard someone yelling, "Hey, what the hell do you boys think you're doing?" Our heads spun around, and Brett and I both saw this 50-something guy with a bald patch and a pot belly, wearing a black t-shirt and khaki shorts. We told him we were just fishing, and he started asking if we had permission, if our parents knew what we were doing. Basically all this stuff to try and get us to leave. Brett started talking back to the guy, asking if our new spot was on his land, and he said no, but that it must have been someone's land, and he'd call the cops on us if we didn't make ourselves scarce. I was about to suggest that we just leave and come back later or something when we heard another voice from the opposite side of us asking what the problem was. Brett and I once again turned around to see a second guy walking towards us from the opposite direction. He looked to be about the same age as the guy trying to chase us off, but was taller, skinnier, and had well-combed hair and wore a cardigan, kind of like Mr. Rogers, if Mr. Rogers wore glasses. The angry guy started explaining that we had no right to be fishing there, especially without a license. But then the guy with glasses said it was his land that we were fishing on and that we had his permission to be there. I remember how he said, "You can call the police if you like, but I don't think they'll appreciate you wasting their time, do you?" The pot-bellied killjoy guy looked all flustered for a second, then walked off grumbling to himself about how kids got no respect these days. Now, once the guy was out of earshot, we thanked the Mr. Rogers look-alike for having our backs, and also for giving us permission to fish on his land. He just chuckled and said, "This isn't my land, but that guy was a jerk-off. He told us his land boundary was about a half-mile back, but that he liked walking out that way because of all the wildlife and stuff. Seeing as we were on public land, we'd have to relocate if the cops did show up, but Mr. Michaels, as he called himself, had bought us a little time before anyone else came along who found reason to bother us. Obviously, we thought Mr. Michaels was awesome, and he seemed very impressed by Brett's improvised rods. Then, after a brief exchange, he carried on with his nature walk, and we just carried on fishing. With it being our regular fishing spot, we visited that larger pond as often as we could that summer, and every so often, we'd spot Mr. Michaels out on one of his walks. At first, all he'd do was come talk to us a little, ask how the fish were biting, stuff like that. But then, after a while, he'd see us, say hi, and then come back around 20 to 30 minutes later with some of his wife's baking or some cold cans of soda, whatever he could spare. Mrs. Michaels must have been an incredible baker, because whatever he brought us was guaranteed to be good. And sometimes he'd stop and eat with us, enjoying the scenery and asking us questions. Most of the time, we'd talk about nothing in particular, either fishing or baseball or school. But then one day, Mr. Michaels asked us if either of us had girlfriends. Now, I was 12, and Brett was almost a whole year older at 13. And though we'd experienced very innocent crushes here and there, we didn't have girlfriends or anything like that. Mr. Michaels asked if there were any girls at school we liked, and having already discussed the topic, both me and Brett were like, no, not really. Mr. Michaels laughed and told us, well, don't force it. The world's going to tell you how you should want all sorts of different things, but the only thing you should be paying attention to is what your heart tells you. Pretty wholesome, right? We thought so too. I mean, we thought Mr. Michaels was just about the coolest person either of us had ever met. And having grown up without a stable father figure in my life, I definitely appreciated having someone like that around. Especially when Brett had to go visit some relatives out of state and I was left on my own. If I wanted to go fishing, I had my own homemade fishing rod by that point, so it wasn't like I had to ask Brett to borrow his. I used to walk down to the fishing hole whenever I wanted, dig up a few worms, and then get to luring the biggest fish possible out into the shallows. Fishing was just as much fun as it was with Brett, but I used to worry about being alone. I was always short for my age, and with my slight stutter, people who didn't know me all that well tended to think that I was either much younger or much dumber than I was, which naturally made me a very ripe target for bullies. I didn't think that I had to worry about that out near the good old fishing spot, as I tended to just see Mr. Michaels on his walks, or stopping by to deliver some muffins. But then one day, Mr. Michaels stopped by while I was fishing and started acting a little weird. He used to ask us questions from time to time, just about our lives and such, and that day Mr. Michaels started asking me about my family. I told him everything, or at least almost everything, that I had moved around a lot, and that I had a dad, then a stepdad, and then no dad at all. He then asked if I liked living with my uncle, and I said it was whatever, and that my mom would probably move us again soon. Mr. Michaels usually had some piece of worldly advice to offer, something that would cheer us up or help us look on the bright side of things. But when I said that thing about probably moving soon, he didn't say anything at all. He just got up, walked off without even saying goodbye. That wasn't like Mr. Michaels at all, but at the time, I wondered if something I'd said hit a little too close for comfort. I might have been 12, but I wasn't dumb. I knew grown-ups got upset over weird things, or not weird, but things they either couldn't or wouldn't explain to me. I figured it was either something like that or that he felt guilty for bringing up a sensitive subject. I noticed a lot of adults seemed to show sympathy for me whenever the subject of family came up. It was something I'd been dealing with ever since my parents' divorce back when I was like 6 or 7. So maybe Mr. Michaels just felt bad all of a sudden, then walked off because he was kind of choked up. I say all this because I thought about it a lot, and I did so because I had time to think about it a lot, because all I did after he walked off was sit there fishing for another few hours before finally calling it a day and walking back home with my meager catch. The next day, I headed back down to the fishing hole after lunch, and after about an hour of sitting there, Mr. Michaels showed up again. He greeted me warmly as he approached, so I figured all of yesterday's awkwardness had been forgotten. He didn't bring it up at first. He just acted like it never happened. which was honestly fine by me because I didn't want to talk about it either. He just walked up, sat down next to me, and asked how the fishing was going. We made small talk for a few minutes about the fishing, the weather, stuff like that. And then he said something like, "I want to apologize for just walking off like that yesterday." I told him it was fine, and he went on to explain that he too had grown up in an unstable family. My situation reminded him a little too much of his own, which, as I said, was one of my initial suspicions. Mr. Michaels then said that family wasn't always a matter of blood, and that the best part about growing up was that, at least to a degree, you got to choose your own family. I figured that was probably the poignant, life-affirming thing that he wished he'd said the day before, and I appreciated it all the same. I also appreciated it when he said that if I wanted to, I could consider him a member of that chosen family, but only if I really wanted to. I told him sure and thanked him, but I knew it was kind of a platitude. He just felt bad hearing a kid talk about the same kind of childhood he went through, and all he wanted to do was make me feel better about it. But like I said, I've been experiencing the same thing almost all my life, so while I knew to just be polite and thank people for whatever it was they'd said, it wasn't like it was some Hollywood moment where I burst into tears like, "Well, gee, Mr. Michaels, does that mean you're going to be my new dad?" Instead, I asked Mr. Michaels if he had kids of his own, and he said yes. He had 2 girls, but they had all grown up and moved out, one to the city and one to college. I thought I'd figured out another reason why he liked me and Brett so much. We were like the 2 young sons that he never got to have. The next time I went down to the fishing hole, it was Saturday. Brett was due back from his relatives on that Monday, so it was my last solo fishing session for the foreseeable future, and I was pretty sure I'd see Mr. Michaels at some point. With it being the weekend, I was there for maybe an hour or so before he showed up, and when he did, we did our usual thing of making small talk and watching the world go by until he turned and asked me a question. He asked if I had thought about what he'd said about a chosen family, and I said sure, a little. He then asked if I liked the idea of him being a kind of father figure to me, and while I said sure, I guess, it wasn't entirely out of courtesy. I liked Mr. Michaels, and so did Brett. And although the whole chosen family thing seemed kind of cheesy to me, I thought it was coming from a good place, so I figured I'd just go along with it. But then Mr. Michaels started acting strangely again. He told me that the bond of family came with a certain kind of love, and I just sat there wondering where he was going with that. And then he went on to say that over the previous few weeks, he'd come to develop feelings of familial love, and that I'd been wondering if those feelings were reciprocated. He spoke real fancy like that at first, and I guess because he was beating around the bush, but I think that he must have seen the look on my face and figured it was there because I didn't understand it. In the next moment, he just straight up asked me if I loved him. There was a brief pause before he clarified that it was that familial love he was talking about, and I remember giving him a very reluctant sure, I guess. But he wasn't done. This is the point where I think Mr. Michaels was another one of those adults who thought that I was a little slow because of the way he was talking to me. It was like he was talking to a much younger kid, or maybe one with a learning disorder or something. 12 isn't 18, but I was still like, why is he talking to me like this? I knew something wasn't right. I just couldn't see exactly what was happening, not until Mr. Michaels began to talk again. He told me that people who love each other sometimes touch one another as a way of expressing that love. And that's the point where I started to feel truly uncomfortable. Mr. Michaels saddled up to me a little, and I remember feeling my body tense up as he did. I realized where he was going and what he was trying to do, and it made my skin feel like it was going to crawl off my bones. Mr. Michaels then asked, in this sort of shaky voice, if he could touch me as a way of expressing his love. The moment he finished his sentence, I got up and walked off without saying a word, just like he did the day before. I remember walking back to my uncle's house, and at the risk of sounding overly dramatic, it was almost like that part from the opening of 𝗥𝗲𝗶 Private Ryan. If you know that movie, do you remember the part where Tom Hanks has just kind of sat there on the beach? And he's having some kind of episode where his ears are ringing and everything seems like it's really far away? That's honestly what it felt like walking back to my uncle's place. I just felt kind of numb. Like I was so trapped in my own thoughts that everything else seemed far away. Or like sort of background noise. I walked into the kitchen via the back door, which was kept unlocked during the day so I could get in and out at will, and I walked straight past my mom and up to the guest bedroom without so much as even looking at her. That gave her a clue that there was something wrong. So she followed me up and asked me a few questions, and then it all came spilling out of me, along with many, many tears. I think one of the worst things about it was I was old enough to actually understand what was happening. It's a terrible thought, but I guess some kids get touched so young that it becomes sort of a repressed memory. I'm not a psychologist, but I know that's a thing. But that obviously wasn't the case with me. And the second Mr. Michaels mentioned touching after asking if I loved him, my first thought was basically, oh my Jesus titty slapping Christ. Mr. Michaels is a predator. I wasn't confused on what his intentions were, even if he was trying to put such an innocent mask on such an ugly thing. And honestly, it absolutely destroyed me. It was the idea that someone so nice, so seemingly nice anyway, could have such vile intentions, and that he could be so cunning about it. I mean, he'd been slowly, steadily, and patiently grooming us for almost 2 whole months. He'd been working to earn our trust, waiting for the right moment, and then when he heard that my mom and I moved around a lot, and possibly coupled with an assumption that I was a little slow, Mr. Michaels figured that I was the perfect target. He was wrong, of course, and I got away before he could do anything. But simply the fact that he considered me a target was something I found incredibly disturbing and upsetting. Now, this was back in the late 70s, and honestly, I'm not sure what kind of reaction it'd get now. But after I told my mother, she told my uncle, and when my uncle told the local sheriff, they did something. I don't know what it was because I don't think they ever officially arrested Mr. Michaels. All I know is that one day I was told that I didn't have to worry about him anymore and that he'd moved someplace far, far away. We were told it was safe to go down to the good fishing hole again, without any fear of seeing old Mr. Michaels walking up in his cart again, and with a basket of his wife's baking. But that didn't have the desired effect because I wasn't relieved to hear we'd never see him again. I was actually heartbroken. Brett was just as shocked as I was to find out Mr. Michaels was what he was, but his actions mirrored my own in many respects. We were devastated to think that we wouldn't see him again, but not because we truly missed this guy. It was because we realized Mr. Michaels never really existed in the first place. At least not in the way that he presented himself. It's kind of hard to articulate, I guess. But we knew we'd missed the Mr. Michaels who had our backs, who brought us food, and who gave us life advice. Only the brutal truth was that the version of Mr. Michaels we'd come to know was a lie, a person dreamed up by an incredibly dangerous predator whose goal was to lull us into a false sense of trust and security. And when the truth became clear, it changed the way I thought about adults for a long time. I guess you could call it our loss of innocence. The summer me and Brett realized that the world was much darker than it seemed. Many years later, when I was all grown up, I heard some radio evangelists talking about the devil, how he lies, how he deceives, how he tricks you into thinking he's your best friend before he turns and shows his real face. If that's the case, then I think I met him, and his name is Mr. Michaels. The trap? Oh, Michaels. Oh, Joseph wrote. And out for rewrite. I've been playing country music for almost 40 years now in bars and honky-tonks, from Shreveport to Kalamazoo. Music has always been my first love, but my second is people. And part of the fun of playing music is getting to meet some of the folks who appreciate it so much. After all, their hard-earned dollars keep gas in our tanks, food in our bellies, and strings on our guitars. So, I figured the least I can do is accept a beer or two when they offer to buy and let them tell me all about their favorite Hank song. And every so often you meet a truly great American, and there are some folks out there I'll remember for the rest of my life. But then sometimes, you meet someone who makes it glad to be leaving town the next morning. We were in a college town called Brookings, up in South Dakota. Nice place, and for the most part, nice people too. We played for 3.5 hours at a joint called the Wild Hare. They had a good bar, a good crowd, and served alcohol until 2 in the morning. So after the show, we pulled up a stool, ordered some bar food, and nursed a few beers with the locals until closing time, selling CDs and shirts and whatever else we could hawk to them. But it wasn't just about making a few extra bucks. You shake a guy's hand after playing his favorite song, and he's twice as likely to come back and see you the next time you're in town. Anyway, about 1:30 in the morning, most of the bar's patrons were steadily making their departure, and even some of the band had called it a night and headed back to the bus. In the end, it was just me sitting on a bar stool and our drummer, Larry, trying to convince people to play a round of pool with him. I was getting ready to head out when some old-timer slumps down a stool next to me and starts telling me how we played a damn good show. I told him I appreciated it, and then we got to talking about music and what it's like touring the country and living on the road. I remember how after ordering us the last couple of beers, the stranger asked me if we ever broke down, like out in the middle of nowhere. I told him sure, once or twice, but that sleeping at a truck stop could sometimes be way scarier than sleeping on some dirt road outside of Nowheresville, USA. He then asked if we carried any protection on the bus with us, and by protection, I don't mean the kind you keep in your wallet. I told him our driver, who doubled as security on an informal basis, was usually packing a pistol of some kind, and that sure, there was occasionally a gun or two on the bus, depending on where we were and who was touring with us. I made a joke about how I hoped he wasn't an ATF agent, and the guy laughed before swearing on his mama that he wasn't no Fed. He then asked if our driver had ever had to use his pistol. I told him we'd been in some sticky situations and had some real close calls, but that by the grace of God, I had never seen anyone shot. He then started telling me how not only had he once been forced to defend his life and property, but he'd taken the lives of 3 men who tried to kill him. I asked if he was a veteran because he looked about the age to have served in Korea, or maybe World War II, but he shook his head. Never served a day in his life. It had been a home invasion, and according to him, it was the most significant event of his entire life. The old-timer said that he lived in a big house that he bought many years before to house his wife and 5 children. But after a car accident claimed her and their 2 daughters, and his sons grew up and moved elsewhere, he was left all alone. That kind of lifestyle suited the old-timer for a while, but then crystal meth got a hold of a lot of the folks around that county, and everything changed. Theft and violent crime went through the roof. And once all the gas stations, liquor stores, and credit unions had been hit, tweakers started targeting people in their homes. The first time the old-timer was robbed, the tweakers took one of his air conditioning units while he was at work. They must have figured that it was just him living there alone, because they started targeting the guy's house at least once, sometimes twice a week. He took to staying up on his porch with a pot of coffee and a shotgun, just waiting for them to show up. Depriving himself of sleep like that damn near made him sick. But one night he sees lights at the end of his driveway. Minutes later, 2 tweakers are sneaking up the path. Then, just as they come close enough, he fires off a warning shot over their heads. But then, instead of just taking off like scared jackrabbits, the tweakers start shooting back as they run off. The old-timer ducks for cover as bullets come flying at him. Then the last thing he hears before the tweakers drive off is, "We'll be back, you dumb son of a... and when we do, we're going to kill you." The old-timer goes to talk to the town sheriff, who tells him that while he'd every right to use lethal force to defend himself against deadly threats, it might not be such a good idea if he was outnumbered and outgunned by a bunch of jacked-up tweakers. And under any other circumstances, the sheriff might have placed 2 of his boys on a nearby highway to act as a kind of quick reaction force. But given the recent meth-fueled crime wave, he didn't have the bodies to spare. The old-timer said the sheriff told him how, on this occasion, it might be best that he made himself scarce for a few days. Once he made sure that he was up to date on his home insurance payments, he was entitled to stand his ground and put up a fight. But he had to ask himself, was that old empty house worth dying for? And that old-timer said that he told the sheriff that he was right, and that he'd be out of town for a few days before returning home, picking through whatever was left, and spiking a for sale sign in the front yard. He even stopped by the sheriff's department to let him know that he was heading out, but not before making a few arrangements and tending to a few pieces of unfinished business. A few days later, this guy rolls back into town to find bullet holes all over the rear doors of a moving truck that he'd rented before heading out of town. The house was fine. Everything was in its place. But someone appeared to have shot up the moving truck. This guy's checking things out and sees no one's tried to break into the cab. But after opening up the back of the truck, he finds 3 dead bodies. A short while after, the sheriff arrives. And this guy said everyone was almost gagging from how bad the smell was inside the truck. But he also said that it didn't take long to figure out why the inside smelled so bad. Before shooting and stabbing the hell out of each other, 3 local tweakers had decided to use the rear storage of the truck as a bathroom. Then, at first glance, after relieving themselves, the tweakers closed the truck's door, then proceeded to cut each other up and blow each other away. The sheriff said that he'd never seen anything like it, but then again, all kinds of weird things have been happening since meth took over the narcotics scene. The old-timer said that once the scene was all cleaned up, the sheriff told him that those tweakers had accidentally locked themselves in the back of the moving truck, because, by the looks of things, the lock had malfunctioned and couldn't be opened from the inside. According to the sheriff, if it wasn't for the triple murder, the truck company might be liable for damages. But then the company might well have proof of maintenance, as they often do, meaning they could prove the malfunction was down to a consumer fault. The old-timer said the sheriff then asked him plain if he had anything to do with that lock not working, and he said no. So that was just about the end of it. Only that wasn't strictly true about the old-timer, not doing any lock tinkering. Not only had he heavily tampered with the truck's lock, but he'd never even left town in the first place. The old-timer told me that he'd rented the most secure hauling truck possible, one that was almost impossible to break into from either inside or outside. He then tinkered with the interior lock, tested it out on an unwitting friend of his to make sure it wasn't functional from the inside, then got busy with the next stage of his plan, making the back of that truck look like it was loaded up with electronics. He used all the old TV, radio, and VHS boxes that he kept up in the attic, stuffed them full of junk to make them feel fuller, then left the rear doors of the truck wide open like it was bait. The next night, those tweakers show up, just like they'd promised. 3 of them, all armed to the teeth. They showed up to get revenge for that old-timer having fired that warning shot, which I'm guessing they thought was just a miss shot and not a warning. But upon seeing that big old moving truck with what looked like thousands of dollars worth of appliances in it, well, they just couldn't resist. All 3 climbed inside, looked through all the boxes, and acted like they just won the state lottery. Then out comes you-know-who from his hiding place to slam the truck's rear doors shut, locking them inside. At first, the tweakers were spooked, what with the doors just slamming closed on them like they did. Then they got frustrated when the interior door handle wouldn't function, each of them saying something like, "Here, let me try," and then cussing the thing out when it wouldn't budge. It took them a while to realize that they were trapped in the back of that old moving truck, but once they did, they started to panic. The old-timer said they tried shooting the lock out, and when that didn't work, they tried shooting holes in the doors, and then thinking their boots might be able to do the rest. He said they spent hours trying everything they could think of to get themselves out of that truck, but it was no good. There was no way out. The old-timer and his buddy had tested out just about everything, with the buddy being none the wiser, of course, until the old-timer was happy that the truck was inescapable, at least without any serious industrial equipment. And unless they just up and stole it, no meth heads are out there driving with industrial strength cutting equipment. It took those fools hours and hours before they figured out that they were trapped. And when they did, they started calling for help. Then, and only then, did the old-timer call out to them and tell them exactly what had happened to them. He said they were furious and tried firing shots in his direction through the side of the truck. But as his presence there before me that night confirmed, those shots flew wildly astray. He told those foolish sons of exactly how he tricked them into walking into their own tomb. And he says it was only when he used that word tomb that it really dawned on them what was happening. He said they begged and pleaded, swearing they wouldn't hurt him if he'd only let them out. The whole thing had been a big old misunderstanding, they said. Some people were not to be messed with. They just didn't know that he was one of them. They went from promising not to hurt him to promising him hundreds, then tens of thousands of dollars as a reward. The old-timer said that he knew it was all bullcrap. They'd have said just about anything to get out of that truck. And unfortunately for them, it was way beyond forgiveness. See, most people would have trapped those tweakers in that truck, called the sheriff, and then laughed their asses off while the deputies dragged them out of the back in cuffs. But that's not what the old-timer had in mind. He let those tweakers sweat it out in that truck with no food or water for 3 whole days. And by then, they were drinking their own pee and eating the cardboard from the TV and VHS boxes to stave off the hunger. After that, he didn't think it'd be much longer before they turned on each other. And when they did, it went off like the 4th of July in there. I'm not saying that those boys didn't get what they deserved. There sure is something poetic about them getting stuck in a kind of man-sized rat trap. But what really sent a chill through me was how proud that old-timer was of himself. And how he laughed until he wheezed, thinking about them begging for help. He said that they were praying, crying for their mamas, and he was grinning like a madman, telling me the things that he'd say to them. He used to talk about them eating each other, wondering who was going to draw the short straw. He did his best to make sure that they went slowly crazy without any food or water until they finally just snapped. As I mentioned already, I'm not saying that that guy didn't do the right thing. I'm just saying I think he went about it in a completely wrong way and lost a piece of his soul in the process. The price of escape. I was a university lecturer for the better part of 20 years. And in that time, I've met some great students and some not-so-great students. One lad, an international student from a country that'll remain unnamed, was probably the most difficult student I'd ever come across. His country of origin shall remain unnamed because, frankly, he was the only problematic student from that nation that I'd ever had the displeasure of dealing with. Every other international student from this particular country was respectful, considerate, and exceptionally hardworking. But this one was not. The first thing he told me after realizing that my first initial stood for Maria, and not something like Matthew, was that no one in his country would take a female professor seriously. I simply replied, "If you want to pass in grade, you could take the attitude of, when in Rome." He seemed to find that amusing, and while he claimed that he'd show me all the respect I deserved, he did so with a deeply patronizing tone that suggested he would never have done the same if we were in his nation of birth. When it dawned on him that he'd actually have to work to get a passing grade, the student in question became incredibly ill-tempered, and his performance dropped off completely. He became more and more problematic as the weeks went by, until one day he simply stopped attending lectures. Initially, I had absolutely no issue with him whatsoever, because it had gotten to the point where he could be rather disruptive from time to time. But after a while, I started to wonder what was happening with him. I ended up asking a colleague if she'd heard anything about him, and I'll never forget the look on her face as she asked me, "You haven't heard?" As it turns out, the surly student that I had had problems with had been arrested by the Cambridgeshire police on charges of kidnap, false imprisonment, and grievous bodily harm. It took a while for the whole story to come out because, at first, no one knew anything other than the crimes he'd been charged with. But it didn't take long for people to piece things together and link it to another worrying on-campus incident. About a week before the problematic student stopped attending lectures, someone had filed a missing persons report with the police. This person claimed a friend or housemate of theirs, a female Thai student, had gone out for a drinks date with a fellow student and then failed to return home. Students staying over at each other's flats or dorms is a very common occurrence. So for the first 24 hours or so, no one batted an eye. But then, after another 24 hours without any communication from her, the girl's friends became concerned. They contacted the police and gave them the name of their friend's date, and officers were dispatched to the date's home. The date turned out to be the same student I'd had problems with, but he claimed to have no idea where she was. The police then tracked the girl's mobile phone and discovered it was within just 50 meters of the guy's flat. So, back they went to ask him a second round of questions, but not before acquiring a search and seizure order from a local judge. This allowed them into the student's flat, where, upon entry, they found their missing Thai girl. After accompanying the male student for drinks, the student had followed the male back to his flat. He'd been perfectly nice and charming through the course of their evening, but upon arriving back at his flat, his demeanor must have changed completely. When she expressed a desire to leave, the student became violent. And when things became physical, he restrained her, tied her wrists and ankles, and then proceeded to beat and torture her with a cigarette lighter. The victim was told that it was her education on why she couldn't leave him, and the sooner she accepted that she was his property, the sooner her ordeal would end. From what I understand, the whole thing caused something of an international incident at the university, and the girl's family wanted to see their daughter's abuser prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And it's just the punishment wasn't anywhere near in line with the crime. Instead of being sent to prison, the student agreed to pay the victim a hefty sum in compensation before being deported from the UK and given a lifetime ban from returning. I know that's at least something, but hearing that he'd basically gotten away with it was just as shocking as hearing about what had done in the first place. There must have been an awful lot of diplomatic wrangling going on behind the scenes. And although I've only a cursory knowledge of it, I know the world of international relations can be a murky one indeed. It just makes me sick to think of that poor girl, of everything she went through, and know that the person who did it was simply able to buy their way out of a prison sentence. Because for men like that, prison is the only place for him. Whispers on Parkfield. I used to live on Parkfield Road near Lark Lane in Liverpool. My local supermarket was the Tesco on Erith Road, so every time I needed to buy food, I'd walk all the way down Parkfield from my flat, which was in a house at the very top of the road near Prince's Park. Most of the houses on Parkfield are basically old Georgian mansions. I'm talking beautiful old buildings with long drives and grand entranceways that I'm guessing used to be occupied by the city's elite. But nowadays, most have been converted into apartments, which have 5 to 7 flats in them. Some of them boast some truly exquisite architecture, but while they're nice to glance at, it's generally not good form to stop and stare at someone's house or place of work. So I just minded my own business and kept on walking past. But that's not to say that I didn't notice that 1 or 2 of the old mansions had been converted into stuff that wasn't apartments. I knew one had been converted into a nursery, and another was like a vet's or something. But I was never curious to find out anything more about. So one morning I leave for work at 7 a.m. I'm walking down Parkfield, still half asleep, earbuds in, podcast on, and some coffee in hand. I was about halfway down the road, headed for St. Michael's train station, when I saw a guy standing still on the pavement in front of me. It looked like he was waiting for someone, maybe a taxi or car share or something. But other than very briefly regarding him, I didn't pay much attention to him at all. That all changed, though, when I walked past him, and he said something that I couldn't make out over the noise of my podcast. I was almost certain that it was directed at me, so I stopped and pulled out my earbuds, and then asked who he was talking to. He was looking right at me as I turned. So clearly he was talking to me, but he didn't answer my question or anything. He just kept on talking, even though I hadn't heard the first thing he'd said. I remember exactly what he said because it was one of the weirdest things anyone's ever said to me in my entire life. He goes, "Well, they're all burning in one big pile, and every day there's more. It probably took my half-asleep brain a microsecond longer than it normally would. But as soon as I realized the fellow was just chatting nonsense, I said, "Keep, okay," in a sort of "so please don't kill me, crazy person" kind of way, and then carried on walking towards the train station. I suppose if you live in any city on the planet, you're bound to encounter a few head cases from time to time. I just didn't expect to encounter one that early in the morning. It didn't scare me or anything. I just thought, what a weird bloke. Then, by the time I got to the office and saw the massive stack of invoices that I had to work through, it was basically forgotten about for the next 8 hours. Until it came time to commute home again. The fellow wasn't there that time, nor was he there any other time I walked down Parkfield Road for the next 2 months. But then, one morning, bright and early, there he was again in the exact same spot I'd seen him the first time. And he wasn't alone. The fellow was standing with 2 women, both in their 50s or 60s, who both appeared to be reading. Since there were 3 of them on the pavement, I decided to cross over onto the other side so I'd have more room to pass. But as I did, I couldn't help but peek over at the 3 of them. The fellow caught me looking, and although he didn't say anything, we locked eyes and smiled before I quickly turned my head away. But before I did, I noticed the 2 women, who looked like they were reading from little books, appeared to be whispering something too, like they were reading aloud. Now this is the point where a lot of your American listeners are going to stop and think, hang on, this sounds familiar. And to be fair, if you're thinking what I'm thinking, then you're thinking the right things. But the issue in question isn't such a massive deal over here as it is over on your side of the pond. I'm not trying to turn it into a dunk on you or anything. We just have different issues over here. Cue the overwhelming and unflattering agreement. And that's why I could walk past them a second time and not piece together what they were doing with where they were choosing to do it. I blame it on the sleepy brain, personally. Both times I saw the weird fellow, I'd only been awake 30 minutes, and since I was on my way to work, I didn't exactly have time to stop and chat. It was literally days later when I realized that we were standing outside of the vet, facing the place from across the street. So I decided to employ a bit of the old Google foo to try and work out what was going on. It was called something like the 𝗢𝗏𝗄𝗏 Clinic. Not its actual name, of course, but something equally unassuming. It then took me mere minutes to figure out what its purpose was there. There was a lot of flowery language around the subject. They just didn't come out and say it on one page, but after just the teeniest bit of clicking around, I discovered what the clinic was for. It wasn't a vet, it was an abortion clinic. And that's why the people were praying outside of it. I've since come to learn that protesting abortion clinics is quite a big thing in the States, and a lot of the time the protests get pretty vicious. I guess now, before the comment section erupts, I'd like to make it clear that I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anyone. In a free country, people should be free to pray wherever they want, right? And I don't live there, so I don't really know exactly what's going on. But that's not what I found so creepy about that man. The one who said that initially unintelligible thing to me about them all burning down in one big pile. He was talking about the aborted babies, and he was talking about them burning in hell. I think you'd have to be exceptionally sturdy of a person for that mental image not to send a shudder through you. It certainly did with me once I realized what that guy was referring to. Sometime after that, I heard about the fellow getting arrested. I'm guessing someone reported him to the police, and that he was in the habit of saying things to people as they walked past. I don't know what law that's breaking, but that's just not on, is it? Saying things about babies burning in hell to people going through a horrible period in their lives. Now I know this can be a controversial topic, but I don't know. If you're going to pray, do it quietly across the street like those 2 women. Don't make a big thing out of it. And certainly don't go telling passing strangers things about piles of babies burning in hell.